The war was a beast that lived on noise. It fed on the scream of artillery shells, the grinding shriek of tank treads on cobblestone, the stuttering monotony of machine gun fire. Jack Talbot, for 3 long years, had been a chronicler inside the beast's belly. He had transcribed its roars into dispatches that ran in 100 newspapers. But now, in the chaotic spring of 1945, the beast was dying, and its death rattle was unpredictable. The solid front had shattered into a confused mosaic of advance, retreat, and sudden, eerie pockets of nothing. Jack's body was a map of this fatigue. Every joint ached with the memory of 100 jeep rides from Normandy to the Rhine and beyond. His fingers, stained with ink and nicotine, would sometimes tremble slightly when he wasn't holding his typewriter or a cigarette. He sat in the passenger seat of the battered Willys, his eyes closed behind his glasses, not sleeping, but retreating from the visual overload of a collapsing world. In the back, secured with a worn strap, sat his royal typewriter, its keys muted under a canvas cover. It was his tool, his weapon, his burden. Sergeant Louis Dawson guided the jeep with automatic skill, his large hands loose on the wheel. A veteran of Italy before this, his eyes never stopped moving. They didn't just look. They assessed. The density of a woodland to the left, the sight lines from a farmhouse on a hill, the potential cover of a ditch. His carbine rested against his knee, a silent companion. He had been assigned to drive Talbot months ago, a job he initially resented, but now understood. The correspondent didn't play hero, didn't get in the way. He just watched. And in his watching, Louis saw a different kind of courage, one that left a man hollowed out. In the back, next to the typewriter, sat Leo. Younger, wire-tight. His gaze was different from Louis's tactical scan. Leo was a translator, a Pole from Warsaw who had seen the beast up close before it ever turned west. His knowledge was visceral, local. He read the landscape not for threats, but for stories. A broken cart meant fleeing civilians. A certain type of rubble spoke of SS reprisals. He was silent, his arms crossed, as if holding himself together. They had become detached from the infantry column they were following, the traffic snarl of victory as frustrating as the logistics of siege. Jack had seen a narrow, gravel lane branching off into a stretch of wooded hills. "Take that turn, Louis," he had said, his voice flat. Not an order, a request. He needed to file a piece, he explained. Not about the capture of another town, but about the silence that followed. The pause. The world holding its breath. Louis had glanced at the lane, his sergeant's mind calculating risk, then at Jack's exhausted profile. He had nodded once, a sharp, downward jerk of his chin, and turned the wheel. The lane wound through pine forests, still holding last night's chill. They passed a shattered German ambulance, its red cross faded and bullet-ridden, its interior a blackened shell. Further on, a small village lay absolutely still. White bed sheets, the universal flag of surrender, hung from windows like ghosts. No movement, no faces. It was as if the inhabitants had simply evaporated, leaving only the hollow architecture of their lives. The silence here was thick, syrupy, pressing against the eardrums. Then the road dipped, and the forest fell away, revealing a wide green valley. It was a pastoral postcard, incongruously slapped into the heart of the war. A gentle river cut a silver path through lush meadows. Willow trees, their branches soft with new yellow-green leaves, wept over the banks. A single half-timbered farmhouse stood on a gentle rise, its roof intact, its windows dark but unbroken. The sun broke through the cloud cover, painting the grass in brilliant, unreal emerald. "Stop here," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the scene. Louis brought the jeep to a halt and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute and immense. It wasn't just an absence of gunfire. It was a presence in itself. The breeze carried the clean scent of water and damp soil. A bird, a small brown thing, chirped experimentally from a willow branch. The sound was startlingly loud. Jack climbed out slowly, his muscles protesting. He took a deep breath, the first one in months that didn't taste of exhaust fumes, cordite, or the cloying scent of decay. He lit a cigarette, the scratch of the match a tiny explosion in the void. He walked a few paces away from the jeep, his boots leaving dark prints in the dewy grass. For a fleeting moment, the weight lifted. The pressure to witness, to record, to make sense of the senseless, evaporated. Here was something pure, untouched. The words began to form in his mind. A dispatch about this valley, about the resilience of simple things, about the quiet that waited, patient, for the thunder to pass. Louis didn't relax. He remained in the driver's seat, but his posture changed. His hand didn't leave the steering wheel, but his fingers tapped a silent, restless rhythm on it. His eyes, narrowed, completed a slow 360-degree sweep of the valley. The perfect meadow was a kill zone. The charming farmhouse, a perfect sniper's nest. The lovely whispering woods could conceal a battalion. This quiet wasn't peaceful to him. It was suspicious. It was the quiet of an ambush not yet sprung. He subtly shifted his carbine to lay across his lap. Leo stood up in the back of the jeep, stretching his stiff limbs. His eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned not for military threats, but for human signs. He saw the farmhouse, but noticed no livestock, no smoke from the chimney. He saw the neatly fenced field, but no recent tire tracks on the lane ahead, only the old ruts filled with rainwater. His gaze lingered on the far tree line, a dark wall at the valley's end. Then he frowned. He stepped out of the jeep, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He took a few steps off the road, crouched down, and picked something up from the mud at the edge of the grass. He held it up, pinched between his thumb and forefinger. A brass rifle cartridge, gleaming dully in the sunlight. German manufacture. It was not old, not verdigreased. The primer at its base showed a fresh, sharp dimple from a firing pin. It had been fired recently, perhaps yesterday, perhaps this morning. Leo didn't call out. He simply turned and looked at Jack, then at Louis. He held the warm brass casing up for them to see. His face was a mask of cool, professional dread. The message was clear. This silence was a lie. They were not alone in this valley. The war was here. It was just waiting. Jack stared at the cartridge, the fragile peace in his mind evaporating as instantly as morning mist. The bird in the willow tree fell silent. The only sound now was the too loud gurgle of the stream and the pounding of his own heart in his ears. The beautiful, quiet valley was no longer a sanctuary. It had just become the most dangerous place in Germany. For 3 long heartbeats, time crystallized. The gleam of the spent cartridge in Leo's hand was a tiny, malevolent sun, reframing the entire valley. The pastoral scene dissolved, every element now a potential threat. The willow trees offered not poetry, but concealment. The farmhouse was not picturesque, but ominously blind. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a held breath, a vacuum waiting to be filled by violence. Sergeant Louis Dawson moved first. His training bypassed conscious thought. In one fluid motion, he was out of the driver's seat, crouching behind the open door of the Jeep, using the engine block as cover. His carbine was no longer on his lap, but pressed against his shoulder, its barrel sweeping a slow, predatory arc across the tree line ahead. His breathing, Jack noted from his frozen position a few yards away, was terrifyingly calm and measured. Leo dropped the casing as if it had burned him and melted back towards the Jeep, not running, but moving with a low, fluid urgency. He positioned himself behind the rear wheel, his body tense. He carried no weapon but a phrase book and a keen mind, which at this moment felt like tragic deficiencies. Jack Talbot remained standing in the grass. His journalist's instinct, the cursed reflex to observe rather than react, held him in place. His eyes, wide behind his glasses, darted from Louis's rigid profile to Leo's terrified expression, then back to the lane. The road curved gently to the right about 200 yards ahead, disappearing into a thicket of dense, dark pines. That was the direction from which they had come. And it was from around that bend that the new sound emerged. It began as a low-frequency murmur, a vibration in the air more than a distinct noise. It was the sound of many men, but not the synchronized chant of a marching column. This was disordered, a weary, discordant hum layered with other, more metallic textures. The faint clank of equipment, the scrape of a boot on stone, the cough of an exhausted engine struggling to turn over. Louis heard it. His head cocked, a hunter listening to the approach of an unknown herd. He glanced back at Jack, his eyes two chips of flint. A single sharp jerk of his head towards the Jeep. "Get back here now." But Jack was paralyzed by a monstrous curiosity. This was the story. This undefined, approaching sound was the truth he had been circling for weeks. He took a half-step forward, not towards safety, but towards the bend. "Jack." Louis's voice was a guttural whisper, harsh and strained, cutting through the thick air. It broke the spell. Jack stumbled back, his legs feeling like wood, and threw himself behind the limited cover of the Jeep's hood. He fumbled for the camera hanging around his neck, a ridiculous gesture, his hands shaking so badly the lens cap rattled. Then, the source of the sound appeared. It was not a squad. It was not a platoon. It was a gray river. Around the bend, flowing with a slow, dismal inevitability, came a column of German soldiers. They emerged from the pines not as a military unit, but as a ragged procession of the damned. They filled the narrow lane from ditch to ditch, a solid mass of feldgrau, the field gray uniforms dirty, torn, and smeared with mud. They moved with the shuffling, broken rhythm of utter exhaustion. Heads were bowed under the weight of steel helmets. Shoulders sagged under the straps of packs and ammunition belts. Their weapons, rifles, machine pistols, Panzerfausts, were not at the ready, but slung or clutched like useless sticks, dragging in the dirt. They kept coming. 20 men, 50, 100, more. The column seemed to have no end, unwinding from the forest's gut. Among the infantry were horse-drawn carts, the animals skeletal and lathered in sweat, their ribs stark against their hides. On one cart, lying atop crates, Jack could see wounded men, their bandages crusted brown and black. The murmur resolved into individual sounds, the rasp of labored breathing, the muttered monosyllabic exchanges, the hollow coughs of sickness and dust. There was no conversation, no songs, no commands, just the grim, mechanical noise of retreat. The three Americans were a tiny island in a sea of enemy gray. The lead elements of the column were now barely 100 yards away, and closing with their plodding, relentless shuffle. Any second, a face would turn, an eye would catch the odd shape of the olive-drab jeep off the side of the road. Discovery felt imminent, a physical pressure building in the air. Louis's finger found the trigger guard of his carbine. His knuckles were white. His mind was calculating the arithmetic of suicide, the magazine capacity, the number of targets, the 3 seconds he might have before they were overwhelmed. It didn't add up. Not even close. Leo, peering under the Jeep's chassis, whispered a translation of the snippets he could catch. They speak of a bridge blown behind them. They say the Americans are everywhere to the north. They ask if this road goes to nothing. They are lost. And then, the miracle. The head of the column reached a point directly opposite their position, and without a single glance towards the jeep, continued past. A young soldier, his face a mask of adolescent grime and hollow-eyed shock, trudged by so close Jack could see the frayed edge of his uniform collar. He never looked up. His world had collapsed inward to the few feet of road in front of his boots. The others followed suit. Dozens, then scores of enemy soldiers passed them by, oblivious. They were not hunting Americans. They were fleeing a reality that had become unbearable. The jeep and its occupants were just another piece of the broken landscape. The shock began to thaw, replaced by a new, even more terrifying understanding. They were safe only as long as they remained part of the scenery. A single moved muscle, a cough, the glint of a lens, any of it could snap hundreds of battle-numbed minds back into a lethal focus. They were surrounded by a sleeping beast, and they were standing in its den. Jack slowly, infinitesimally, turned his head to look at Louis. The sergeant met his gaze. In Louis's eyes, Jack saw the same chilling realization. They were not hidden. They were ignored. Their survival depended on maintaining this absurd, fragile illusion. But for how long? The column continued to pour from the woods, a desperate armed river that showed no sign of stopping. And somewhere in that river, there had to be an officer, someone whose duty would compel him to see what his men did not. The clock was ticking down, not to rescue, but to a catastrophe of their own accidental making. The paralysis that held them was not born of fear alone, but of a profound, cognitive dissonance. Here was the enemy, the abstract force Jack had described in a million typed words, made flesh in a staggering sensory overload of numbers and proximity. The air grew thick with the smell of them, unwashed wool, stale sweat, gun oil, and the faint, sweet, putrid scent of festering wounds from the carts. The sound was a physical presence now, the shuffle of hundreds of boots, a dry, rasping rhythm over the gravel, punctuated by the creak of leather and the occasional heart-stopping clatter of a rifle butt striking a rock. Sergeant Louis Dawson's world had narrowed to a series of tactical nightmares. His eyes tracked, not the mass, but individual threats. The machine pistol slung over that corporal's shoulder. The pair of grenades hanging from the belt of the trudging soldier 10 feet away. The crew-served MG-42 heavy machine gun, its ominous barrel cold and dark, being dragged on a 2-wheeled cart by 2 bone-tired men. One burst from that, and the jeep would be shredded metal and pulp. His finger ached with the tension on the trigger. Every instinct screamed to fire, to take the first ones down, to go out fighting. But the math was immutable, a cold equation of certain death. His job was no longer to attack, but to prevent the single catalyzing event, a sudden noise, a movement that would trigger the slaughter. Leo was pressed against the Jeep's rear tire, his face pale, his breath coming in short, controlled gasps. He had become a vital, terrifying sensor. His lips moved silently, translating the river of German flowing past. They are arguing about surrendering. Some say to find Americans. Others say to keep moving south. They think the war is lost, but they are afraid to stop. They have no orders. They are a flock with no shepherd. His voice was a threadbare whisper, almost lost in the ambient noise. This information was critical. It painted a picture not of a fighting unit, but of a disintegrating organism, driven by base survival instinct. The weaponry was secondary. The true enemy was their collective, directionless panic. Jack Talbot felt the familiar dry-mouthed tremor that usually preceded writing under shell fire. But this was different. This wasn't about observation. This was about intervention. The sheer, staggering scale of the column forced a monstrous responsibility upon him. They were 3 men. They had blundered into the command vacuum of a battalion. The silence they had sought had become a prison of quiet, and the lock was the attention of hundreds of armed, desperate men. He watched faces pass. Not the Germans, but individuals. A boy no older than 16, his helmet comically large, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. A grizzled veteran with a 1,000-yard stare, moving like an automaton, his body present, but his mind already broken. An older man, a civilian Volkssturm conscript probably, in a mismatched uniform, leaning on a comrade, his face gray with pain. Then, Jack saw him. Near the center of the flowing column, moving with a slight, stumbling hesitation, was a younger officer, an Oberleutnant, by the insignia on his grimy collar tabs. One arm was held stiffly across his chest, the sleeve of his greatcoat torn and dark with a large, dried bloodstain. He wasn't leading. He was being carried along by the current of his men. But his eyes, unlike the others, were active. They flickered from side to side, not with tactical awareness, but with a pained, dazed responsibility. He was looking for something, a landmark, a sign, a way out of the trap. He was the potential shepherd. A plan, insane and audacious, began to form in Jack's mind. It was not a soldier's plan. It was a journalist's plan, built on the power of narrative and perceived authority. They were not soldiers in a firefight. They were symbols. The Jeep was a symbol of American mobility and might. His own correspondent's uniform, with its prominent C patch, was a symbol of a system that recorded history. In this void of command, symbols might hold more power than bullets. He caught Louis's eye. With infinitesimally small movements of his own face and hands, he tried to convey his intention. He gestured subtly toward the wounded officer, then to himself, then pointed 2 fingers at his own eyes and toward the officer, signaling, "I see him. He's the one." Louis's response was a minute, frantic shake of his head, his jaw clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. It was suicide. But the alternative was waiting for the inevitable. A single curious glance into the ditch, a spark of recognition from the wounded officer, a trip, a fall, a shouted warning that would draw every eye. They were living on borrowed time, and the debt was coming due. Jack made the decision. It felt less like courage and more like the only logical next paragraph in a story hurtling towards a bloody climax. He slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, lowered his camera. He reached up, not for a weapon, but for the strap of his helmet. He took it off, placing it quietly on the Jeep's hood. The removal of the helmet was a deliberate symbolic act. It made him less a soldier, more a civilian, more human. He then reached into his field jacket and pulled out his most powerful tool, his official war correspondent's credentials, a laminated card with his photograph, his signature, and the imposing seals of the U.S. War Department and Supreme Headquarters. To a lost German officer, it might look like orders, like legitimacy from the victorious world. He held Louis's gaze and gave one final firm nod. It was not a request for permission. It was a statement of intent. He was going. The sergeant's eyes flashed with a mixture of fury, terror, and a desperate, grudging understanding. Louis gave one sharp, almost imperceptible nod in return. His role shifted instantly. He was no longer just a guardian of their lives. He was the guardian of the bluff. His carbine was no longer a tool for a last stand, but a prop to maintain an illusion of control. He adjusted his grip, his aim now loosely covering the area around the officer, a silent promise of consequences if the play went wrong. Taking a breath that felt like his first and possibly last, Jack Talbot stepped out from behind the Jeep. He did not walk towards the road. He moved perpendicular to it, a few deliberate paces into the open grass, placing himself directly in the line of sight of the approaching wounded Oberleutnant. He held his credentials in front of him, not like a shield, but like a banner. He stood erect, forcing an aura of calm authority he did not feel. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently he was sure the entire column could hear it. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to dive for cover. He was a naked man walking into a storm of steel. The first soldiers in his immediate vicinity did not notice him. Their heads remained down. Then, a private at the edge of the column glanced up, his gaze passing over Jack without comprehension, then snapping back. The man's eyes widened. He stumbled, breaking the rhythm of his shuffle. He muttered something, low and guttural. The infection of attention began to spread. One head turned, then another. A low wave of murmuring rippled through the gray mass near him. The river of men began to slow, to coagulate around this strange, static figure in the field. The sound of shuffling boots grew quieter, replaced by a rising tide of confused whispers. Jack's eyes never left the wounded Oberleutnant. The officer, sensing the change in the current around him, looked up. His exhausted, pain-glazed eyes focused on Jack. They registered the uniform, the lack of helmet, the held card. They saw the Jeep, the armed sergeant behind it. Confusion, then a flicker of desperate, wild hope crossed his face. Here, perhaps, was an answer. Here was someone who could tell him what to do. The two men locked eyes across 20 yards of no man's land. The entire monstrous column seemed to hold its breath. The bluff was called. The next move belonged to the German. And Jack Talbot, correspondent, stood utterly alone, waiting to see if the story he was about to write would be one of miraculous surrender or of a brief, final, and utterly insignificant footnote in the war's last chapter. The silence that fell was not the serene quiet of the valley from minutes before. This was a thick, charged, and brittle silence, strained to its breaking point by the collective gaze of hundreds. The shuffling of boots ceased, leaving only the nervous whicker of a horse and the low groan of the wind in the willows. Every eye within sight was now fixed on the solitary, foolish figure of Jack Talbot standing in the damp grass. He was a rock in the gray stream, and the stream had eddied to a halt around him. The wounded Oberleutnant stared. His eyes, bloodshot and shadowed with exhaustion, performed a rapid, instinctive assessment. They catalogued Jack's non-standard uniform, the absence of a weapon, the odd, laminated card held aloft. They flicked to the jeep, noting Sergeant Dawson's rigid, threatening posture behind the carbine, then to the terrified face of Leo peering from behind the wheel. This was not a military patrol. It was something else, something outside the German officer's understanding of the battlefield. And in that uncertainty lay Jack's only sliver of hope. The officer took a hesitant step forward, then another, detaching himself from the clot of his men. His movement was stiff, pained, his injured arm held protectively close. A subtle ripple went through the nearest soldiers. Some took a half-step back, creating a small, informal clearing. Others leaned forward, their expressions a mix of blank curiosity and dawning apprehension. They were a crowd awaiting a verdict. Jack forced himself to move. To stand still was to become a statue, a target. With a calm he did not possess, he lowered his credentials and took 2 deliberate steps toward the officer, closing the distance just enough to be heard, without shouting, but not so close as to seem aggressive. He kept his movements slow, broad, and visible. Every twitch was a potential spark. He raised his free hand, palm out, a universal gesture. Stop. Halt. It was addressed to the officer, but performed for the battalion. The German officer did stop, his eyes narrowing slightly in concentration or pain. Jack saw the man's gaze dart past him, scanning the surrounding hills, looking for the trap, the concealed unit, the logic behind this absurd confrontation. He saw the moment the officer found nothing, only the empty valley. The realization that deepened the confusion on the German's face was Jack's greatest advantage. They were as inexplicable to him as he was to them. Then Jack did the only thing he could think to do. He pointed. Not at the officer, not at the men. He pointed decisively at the side of the road, to a wide, flat area of grass just off the lane. He then made a sweeping, commanding gesture, with his whole arm from the column toward that spot. The meaning was clear, even without words. Move there. Assemble there. He followed this by miming the action of removing something from his shoulder and placing it on the ground. He pointed at the various weapons in the hands of the nearest soldiers, a rifle, a machine pistol, and repeated the gesture. Put them down. Finally, he looked directly at the Oberleutnant and raised his credentials again, tapping the official seals with his finger. He then pointed at the officer, and with a firm, downward chop of his hand, pointed again to the assembly area. The message was a chain of command. By the authority I represent, I order you, and you will order them. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity. It was a pantomime of command staged on the razor's edge of catastrophe. Jack's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, his mouth parchment dry. He was aware of Louis, a statue of lethal tension by the jeep. He was aware of Leo, who had begun to whisper a low, continuous, translated version of the gestures for the benefit of any German who might understand English, his voice trembling but clear. He says, assemble there, lay down arms, by order of Supreme Headquarters. The Oberleutnant did not move at first. A storm of conflict raged behind his eyes. Duty, shame, survival, the crushing weight of responsibility for the weary, hope-starved men behind him. He looked back at his column, a sea of expectant, defeated faces. They were not looking at him with defiance, but with a desperate, pathetic hope. They wanted him to decide. They wanted the nightmare to end. The officer's shoulders, already slumped, seemed to collapse a fraction further. A profound weariness washed over his features, erasing the last vestiges of martial pride. It was not the face of a man surrendering to an enemy, but of a man surrendering to inevitability. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, not to Jack, but to his own fate. He turned slowly to face his men. He did not shout. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, cracked, and carried only a few yards. But it was enough for those nearest to hear. The words were simple. Leo caught them, and his whisper to Jack was a shudder of relief. He says, "It is over. Do as he says. Lay down your weapons there." For a moment nothing happened. The order hung in the silent air, so fragile it might dissolve. Then, a soldier near the front, an older man with a face like worn leather, let out a sigh that was almost a sob. He shuffled out of the column, walked the few paces to the indicated grassy area, and with a sound of profound finality, unslung his rifle and placed it on the ground. He stood next to it, awkward, empty-handed, looking lost. It was the catalyst. Another soldier moved, then another. A slow, deliberate trickle became a steady flow. Men broke from the column, not in a rush, but with the solemn deliberation of a funeral procession. They walked to the field and deposited their weapons: rifles, pistols, machine pistols, bayonets, grenades. They piled them not neatly, but with the careless exhaustion of men discarding an immense burden. The metallic clatter of steel on steel began to ring out, a new, bizarre music of peace. A group of soldiers gently lifted the heavy MG-42 from its cart and laid it on the grass, like a dead beast. The symbolic heart of their unit's firepower was silenced. Jack did not move. He remained at his post, the director of this surreal play, watching his impossible orders being obeyed. The bluff had not just been called, it had been accepted. The authority he had conjured from sheer will and a laminated card had become real. He was no longer just a correspondent. In the eyes of these hundreds of men, he was the face of the victor, the architect of their capture. The weight of it settled on him, a heavier burden than any typewriter. He had stopped a battalion. Now he had to control it. The delicate, terrifying performance was only entering its second act. The initial stunned trickle of compliance became a steady, then a rushing river of surrender. The grassy area Jack had indicated with his audacious gesture transformed before his eyes from a pristine meadow into a sprawling, chaotic dump of a nation's military might. The clatter of weapons was constant now, a cascading percussion of finality. The heavy thud of a rifle stock hitting soil, the metallic rattle of a belt of machine gun ammunition unspooling onto the ground, the dull clang of steel helmets tossed into a growing pile. The air, once carrying the murmur of despondent men, now held the sharper, more industrial sounds of dissolution. But the real work, Jack understood with a chilling clarity, was only beginning. Disarming them was one thing. Containing them was another. A mass of several hundred men, even unarmed, was a volatile organism. Panic, regret, a sudden surge of collective pride, any spark could ignite chaos. They needed order. They needed structure to replace the one they had just discarded. They needed to become prisoners, officially, in their own minds. Sergeant Louis Dawson saw it too. His immediate visceral terror had morphed into a hyper-focused, professional anxiety. The threat was no longer a hail of bullets, but a stampede. He emerged from behind the jeep, his carbine now held not at the ready to fire, but across his chest, a symbol of guard duty. He moved with a stiff, authoritative stride towards the growing mass of men. His eyes, still scanning for threats, now also sought leaders, troublemakers, the ones whose faces showed anger instead of relief. He positioned himself at the edge of the weapon pile, a solitary sentinel guarding a hill of scrap metal. His presence was a line in the dirt. Jack knew he had to cement the illusion of a larger force, of a system already in motion. He turned to Leo, whose face was pale but alight with a frantic energy. "The list," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. "We need a list. Names, ranks, units. Make it look official, like we're processing them." It was a reporter's trick, the power of the document, the authority of the record. Leo nodded, understanding instantly. He scrambled into the back of the jeep and pulled out Jack's heavy, leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen. He did not sit. He stood beside the jeep, the notebook open against the hood, pen poised. He looked, for all the world, like a clerk at the gates of the absurd. Jack then approached the wounded Oberleutnant. The officer was standing apart, watching his men dissolve into a disorganized crowd with an expression of profound emptiness. Up close, Jack could see the details of his suffering: the crude, blood-soaked bandage on his arm, the feverish sheen on his forehead, the tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by clasping them behind his back. Jack met his eyes and gestured, not with the broad pantomime of before, but with smaller, more precise motions. He pointed to the open space in front of Leo, then to the officer himself, then made a writing motion in his palm. The officer understood. He was to be the first entered into the ledger. He straightened his spine, a last ghost of military bearing, and walked stiffly to the jeep. He stood before Leo and began to speak in a formal, subdued tone, reciting his name, his rank, his unit designation. Leo, his hand trembling only slightly, began to write in the notebook, his script careful and deliberate. The act was mesmerizingly mundane. The first entry in the prisoner log was being made not in a command post, but on the hood of a jeep in a field, by a terrified Polish interpreter. This simple ritual had a profound effect on the milling soldiers. They saw their officer cooperating. They saw the official-looking notebook. They saw a process. The chaotic dumping of weapons began to organize itself into a queue. Men, conditioned by a lifetime of bureaucracy and hierarchy, instinctively formed ragged lines, shuffling forward towards Leo and his book. The surrender was becoming administrative. Jack moved among them now, not as a conqueror, but as a stage manager. He used hand signals, points, gentle guiding motions to shape the space. He directed the disarmed men away from the weapon pile, herding them into a larger open area where they could sit. He pointed at a group of healthier-looking soldiers, and then at the horse-drawn carts carrying the wounded, miming the act of lifting. Hesitantly, the men moved to unload their suffering comrades, laying them gently in the shade of the willow trees. The humanity of the act further disarmed the situation, replacing martial tension with a shared, grim pragmatism. He noticed a young Gefreiter, a corporal, who seemed to be instinctively trying to maintain order within his own small group. Jack caught his eye and pointed at him, then made a sweeping gesture along the forming lines of sitting men. The corporal, after a moment of confusion, nodded. He began to move along the rows, quietly instructing men to sit straight, to make room, to be quiet. Jack had just deputized him. The prisoners were now partially policing themselves. The scale of the situation threatened to overwhelm him at every turn. The weapon pile was a sprawling, dangerous mountain. He saw grenades, loose ammunition, explosives for the Panzerfausts. One accident, one act of despair, and it would all be for nothing. He caught Louis's eye and pointed urgently at the explosive ordnance, then made a wide, keeping back motion with his arms. Louis, grasping the new threat, began using his carbine's barrel to gently, carefully push the pile of grenades away from the main heap of rifles, creating a small, isolated island of high explosives. The afternoon sun climbed higher. The surreal tableau solidified. On one side of the lane, a vast, silent assembly of several hundred German soldiers sitting in orderly rows on the grass, their empty hands in their laps, staring at nothing. In the middle, a jeep, where a translator scribbled endlessly in a notebook, a line of men waiting patiently to give their names. On the other side, a monstrous, glinting pile of surrendered weapons, guarded by a single American sergeant. And moving between it all, a man in a correspondent's uniform, orchestrating the entire impossible scene with gestures and sheer, unwavering will. Jack felt the exhaustion now, a deep bone weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He was performing a character, the calm, in-control American authority, and the mask was growing heavy. Every second stretched into an eternity of risk. They had built a dam against a flood of men, but the dam was made of paper and perception. It only needed one man to stand up and ask a simple, logical question. Where are the rest of your troops? For now, the bizarre, bureaucratic normalcy they had conjured held. But the silence of the prisoners was no longer the silence of shock. It was the quiet of a held breath, of a suspension, of disbelief. And Jack knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that the performance could not last forever. The clock was still ticking, and the sound of its gears was the only thing he could hear beneath the crushing, watchful quiet of the valley. The fragile equilibrium they had constructed was a house of cards built on a fault line. It thrived on stillness, on the hypnotic rhythm of the surrender line, on the shared, unspoken agreement to believe in the fiction of American control. For nearly an hour, the only sounds were the scratch of Leo's pen, the low murmur of names being given, and the occasional groan from the wounded under the willows. The sun beat down, warming the discarded metal of the weapon pile, until it gave off a faint, oily smell. Sergeant Dawson's posture had shifted from aggressive guard to a watchful, almost statuesque vigilance, but the tension in his shoulders had not eased. It had simply changed frequency, humming at a lower, more constant note of dread. Jack moved among the seated prisoners, a specter of authority. He met their eyes, held their gaze for a second, then moved on. It was a trick he'd learned observing officers, the projection of assessment, of calm oversight. He checked on the wounded, nodding to the German corporal, who had taken charge of their care. He paused by the pile of grenades, a cold knot in his stomach as he counted them. Each one was a potential end to the entire charade. The first crack came from the east. It was not a sound from the prisoners, but from the world beyond their bubble. A distant, familiar, and terrifying mechanical growl, cutting through the valley's stillness. The sound of a heavy engine, laboring in low gear. Not a jeep, something bigger. And it was coming from the opposite direction the German column had arrived, from deeper inside what was supposedly still contested territory. Every head among the prisoners twitched towards the sound. A low, anxious murmur rippled through the rows of seated men. Jack's blood turned to ice. He spun to face the eastern bend in the road, the one they had not yet traveled. Louis had already pivoted, his carbine coming up to a low, ready position, his body angled to cover both the new threat and the restless prisoners. Leo's pen froze above the notebook. From around the bend, a vehicle emerged. It was a German Kubelwagen, the equivalent of their own jeep, painted in dirty field gray. It carried 3 men, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. As it rounded the corner, and its occupants saw the scene before them, the vehicle swerved slightly, then slowed to a crawl before stopping 50 yards away. The men in the Kubelwagen were not the broken remnants of the retreat. These were different. The driver wore the distinctive camouflage smock of the Waffen-SS. The officer in the passenger seat, a Hauptsturm, Eher by the visible insignia, was clean-shaven, his uniform visibly less ragged. He held a map, which now drooped forgotten in his hand as he stared, his face a perfect mask of incredulous horror. The man in the back was a regular army sergeant, his expression one of pure confusion. Time seemed to warp. The tableau held the hundreds of surrendered men, the mountain of their weapons, the single American jeep, the lone guard, the civilian with a notebook, and now this new sharp fragment of the still functioning German war machine, inserted into the dreamlike scene. The SS officer recovered first. He barked a sharp order. The driver killed the engine. All 3 men dismounted slowly, their movements cautious, their eyes sweeping the hills for the ambush that had to be there. The Hauptsturm, his hand rested on the pistol holster at his belt. His gaze swept over the sea of his countrymen, his lip curling in a sneer of disgust, before finally locking onto the only person who seemed to be in charge, Jack. He began to walk forward, not towards his men, but directly towards Jack. His steps were deliberate, angry, confident. This was not a man defeated. This was a man who believed he still held authority. The fracture in their carefully maintained reality was not just a crack. It was a chasm, and this man was walking across it. A violent ripple of agitation passed through the prisoners. Some looked down, ashamed. Others watched with a fearful, morbid curiosity. The wounded Oberleutnant, who had been sitting apart, slowly, painfully, got to his feet. His face was a conflict of duty, shame, and a desperate need to explain. Jack knew this was the moment. The pantomime was over. This new officer was not exhausted, not lost, not ready to surrender. He was a true believer, and he represented a core of the beast that was not yet dead. If he took control, if he rallied even a fraction of these men, the field would become a slaughterhouse. Jack did not wait for him to speak, to issue a challenge. He had to own the narrative, and he had to do it instantly. He turned his back on the approaching SS officer. It was the most dangerous, calculated gamble of his life. By turning away, he dismissed him. He rendered him irrelevant. He walked, not towards the jeep, but directly towards the seated mass of prisoners, towards the German Oberleutnant, who had first surrendered. He stopped in front of the wounded officer. He looked him directly in the eye, and in a clear, loud, calm voice that carried across the suddenly silent field, he spoke a single, simple sentence in English. Maintain control of your men. He said it not as a request, but as an order to a subordinate. Then he turned, slowly, to face the approaching SS officer, who had stopped, confused by this bizarre interaction. Jack then performed his final desperate act of theater. He pointed at the SS officer. Then he pointed to the ground at his own feet. The meaning was unmistakable, an imperial command. You! Come here! He was no longer a correspondent bluffing. He was the embodiment of the victor, commanding the scene. The power dynamic had to be established in an instant, and it had to be established in front of the entire audience of prisoners. His survival, and the survival of Louis and Leo, depended on the wounded Oberleutnant playing his part, and on the SS officer's ingrained instinct to obey a display of absolute, unshakable authority. The entire valley held its breath. Two forms of authority now stood in the grassy arena: the clean, angry certainty of the SS, and the battered, invented legitimacy of Jack. Between them, the hundreds of prisoners were the jury. And in the wings, Sergeant Dawson's finger rested on his trigger, a single unwavering point of violent contingency, aimed directly at the chest of the Hauptsturmführer. The fragile world they had built balanced on a knife's edge, and the slightest sound, the wrong glance, would send it all tumbling into the abyss. The silence that followed Jack's command was profound, a physical weight pressing down on the valley. All motion ceased. The wind seemed to die. The only thing moving was the slow, creeping dread in Jack's veins. He had drawn a line in the air with his pointed finger, and on it hung everything. The SS Hauptsturmführer stood frozen, a statue of indignant fury. His hand, still resting on his pistol holster, twitched. His eyes, pale and sharp, darted from Jack's impassive face to the sea of surrendered men, to the weapon pile, to Louis's rock-steady carbine trained unwaveringly on his center mass. He was performing his own rapid, brutal calculus. The scene made no tactical sense, which made it infinitely more dangerous. His mind rejected the evidence: a single jeep, 3 Americans, a mountain of discarded arms. Where was the rest? Where were the machine gun nests in the hills, the mortar teams, the encircling infantry? The absence of visible force was, in itself, a form of terrifying psychological warfare. It implied a confidence so absolute it didn't need to display its strength. His gaze finally snapped to the wounded Oberleutnant. It was a look of pure, venomous contempt, a demand for explanation, for redemption, for a spark of resistance. The Oberleutnant met his stare. For a long second, the old Germany and the new one faced each other, the fanaticism of the last stand against the exhausted pragmatism of survival. Then, the Oberleutnant did something subtle, yet monumental. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was not a nod of defiance, but one of profound, weary negation. It is over. Do not. He then turned his back, slowly and deliberately, and faced his seated men, his posture assuming a command he had relinquished only an hour before. He was obeying Jack's order. He was maintaining control of his men. That tiny act of defiance against the SS officer was the fulcrum. The prisoners, watching this silent exchange, saw their own officer choose the new reality over the old. The spell of the SS was broken not by an American, but by one of their own. The Hauptsturmführer's certainty fractured. The arrogant set of his shoulders diminished by a fraction. The confusion returned, now laced with a dawning, humiliating comprehension. He was not facing a weak enemy. He was facing a fait accompli. The battle for these men was already lost. To start a new one now would be suicide, not martyrdom. His eyes returned to Louis's carbine. The sergeant's intent was clear, professional, and devoid of bluff. It was the one element in this surreal picture that was brutally, simplistically real. With a stiffness that radiated suppressed rage, the Hauptsturmführer moved, but not towards Jack. He took a single sideways step, then another, his path angling him away from direct confrontation towards the weapon pile. His hand slowly, visibly, moved away from his pistol. He stopped a few feet from the grotesque hill of rifles and grenades. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the discarded arsenal of a battalion, the tangible proof of his world's collapse. Then, with a jerky mechanical motion, he unbuckled his own pistol belt. The leather rasp was loud in the hush. He held it for a second. The black holster and polished Walther P-38 a symbol of his authority. Now just another piece of scrap. He did not place it gently. He threw it. It landed on the pile with a dull, final thud. The sound seemed to release the tension from his body. His posture sagged. He was no longer a combat officer. He was just another man in a field, waiting for instructions. His two companions, seeing their leaders surrender, moved with resigned haste. The driver and the sergeant quickly added their own weapons to the pile, their movements eager, almost relieved to be divested of the burden. But the crisis was not over. It had merely mutated. The arrival of the Kubelwagen had been a tremor. What came next was the earthquake. From the western road, the direction of the American advance, came a new sound. Not a lone engine, but the deep-throated, powerful roar of multiple vehicles, the grind of heavy-duty trucks, the distinctive squeaking clatter of tank tracks. Hope, for Jack, was immediately poisoned by terror. This was rescue, but rescue was now the greatest threat. A column of victorious, trigger-happy American troops rounding the bend would see one jeep and a battalion of enemy soldiers. Their reaction would be instinctive, immediate, and catastrophic. They would open fire. The prisoners, in panic, would break. They would run for the woods for their discarded weapons. The field would become a killing ground of unimaginable horror. And he, Louis, and Leo would be caught in the crossfire, the authors of their own annihilation. Jack broke into a run. He sprinted past the stunned SS officer, past the weapon pile, towards the western bend. He waved his arms frantically, not in greeting, but in desperate warning. He ripped off his field jacket, holding the pale khaki fabric high, a makeshift, pathetic white flag. He could hear the vehicles slowing, the crunch of brakes. He saw the lead vehicle, an M8 Greyhound armored car, its long 37mm gun pointing down the lane like a probing finger. Behind it, the shapes of trucks and the hulking form of a Sherman tank. The Greyhound's commander, a lieutenant standing in the turret, saw the wild-eyed man in a correspondent's shirt waving a jacket. He saw the sea of gray uniformed men beyond him. His face hardened into a mask of combat alert. He yelled an order. The machine gunner in the turret swung the .50 caliber Browning towards the field. The sound of bolts being charged, of weapons being readied, rippled down the American column like the cocking of a giant gun. Jack was screaming now, his voice raw and breaking. "Don't shoot! They're surrendered! Prisoners! They're disarmed!" He planted himself directly in front of the Greyhound's path, still waving the jacket, his body a shield between the American guns and the German prisoners. He pointed wildly behind him, at the mountain of weapons, at the seated men, at Louis, who was now also shouting and waving his arms. Time stretched into an agony of potential. The American lieutenant's eyes, wide with a mixture of aggression and utter confusion, scanned the impossible scene. He saw the weapon pile. He saw the lack of German arms. He saw the single jeep. His gaze locked onto Jack's correspondent patch. The logic refused to cohere. "Who the hell are you?" the lieutenant finally bellowed, his voice cutting through the idling rumble of engines. Jack, his chest heaving, could only gasp the truth, the only thing that mattered now. "Talbert! War correspondent. They surrendered. To me. They're all prisoners." The words hung in the air, absurd, unbelievable. The lieutenant stared. He looked past Jack at the hundreds of enemy soldiers, then back at the trembling, desperate man blocking his armored car. The machine gun remained trained. But the lieutenant's hand came up, a signal to hold fire. The immediate threat of massacre receded by a degree, replaced by a boiling cauldron of shock, suspicion, and bureaucratic disbelief. The first, violent wave had been stopped. But now, Jack realized with a sinking heart, he would have to explain the unexplainable. He would have to surrender his command. The world exploded into a frenzy of sound and motion. But it was a controlled, official frenzy. The American column, a coiled spring of lethal potential, unfurled with jarring mechanistic efficiency. Soldiers in olive drab poured from the backs of trucks, their M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns held at high port, fanning out with trained aggression to establish a perimeter around the surreal tableau. Their faces were etched with a hard, professional disbelief, their eyes constantly flicking from the disarmed Germans to the lone jeep, struggling to compute the equation. Shouted commands ripped through the valley, sharp and authoritative, replacing the fragile quiet Jack had maintained for hours. Jack Talbert stood frozen, his makeshift white flag of a jacket hanging limp at his side, as the reality he had conjured was dismantled and replaced by institutional might. An infantry captain, his face grim and unyielding, stalked towards him, flanked by two stern-faced sergeants. The captain's eyes took in Jack's correspondent insignia, his lack of weapon, his general air of shell-shocked exhaustion, with palpable suspicion. This was not a relief column greeting a hero. It was an investigation confronting an anomaly. The captain did not offer thanks. He demanded answers, his voice a bark that cut through the diesel rumble. Who was he? What unit was he with? What in God's name was this? Jack's explanations, delivered in a hoarse, fractured voice, sounded insane even to his own ears. A wrong turn, a search for quiet, a column of Germans, a bluff. The words felt small and ridiculous against the scale of the evidence, the vast assembly of prisoners, the staggering pile of weapons. The captain listened, his expression not softening but hardening further into a scowl of profound bureaucratic irritation. This was a paperwork nightmare of epic proportions, and Jack was its inexplicable source. Jack watched, a spectator now, as his invented authority evaporated. American MPs moved in, their white helmets and brassards gleaming, their manner brusque and impersonal. They began the real processing, shouting orders in broken German, gesturing with their rifles, herding the prisoners into tighter, more formal groups for counting and search. The wounded Oberleutnant was approached, not with the strange courtesy of Jack's pantomime, but with curt, efficient interrogation. The SS Hauptsturmkorps was singled out, separated from the others with rough hands and hostile glares, his defiance now meaningless against the impersonal machinery of the victors. Leo was pulled aside, his notebook seized as evidence. He stood by the jeep, looking small and suddenly very young, watching as his careful list of names was taken over by a harried clerk with a clipboard. Sergeant Louis Dawson, after a terse exchange with the infantry captain, finally lowered his carbine. The immense solo responsibility that had held him rigid for hours drained away, leaving behind a profound, trembling fatigue. He leaned against the jeep's fender, lighting a cigarette with unsteady hands, his eyes vacant, staring at the ground as American soldiers swarmed over the weapon pile, disarming the grenades with practiced, wary skill. The prisoners themselves changed under this new regime. The strange, shared dream of their surrender to the lone correspondent was over. The hypnotic spell broke. They were no longer participants in an unprecedented event. They were a problem to be solved. Some looked relieved, the uncertainty finally gone. Others shrank in on themselves, confronted with the cold, hard reality of captivity. The space Jack had moved through, the arena of his performance, was now just a patch of dirt being crisscrossed by dozens of foreign boots. Jack felt a hollowing out, a collapse of the immense psychic energy that had sustained him. The adrenaline that had been a constant fire in his veins guttered and died, leaving ash and a deep, marrow-level cold. He was no longer the director. He was a relic. He watched as an American bulldozer, arriving with the tail of the column, was directed towards the weapon pile, its blade ready to push the arsenal into a pit for disposal. The tools of war he had convinced men to lay down were now just scrap, to be buried and forgotten. As the shadows lengthened, the organized chaos began to assume a grim order. The prisoners were loaded onto the trucks, packed in tight, their faces blank in the fading light. The wounded were tended to with brusque, clinical efficiency. The German officers were driven away in a separate vehicle. The valley was being cleared, restored to empty silence, but it would never again be the quiet Jack had sought. The infantry captain finished his initial assessment and walked back to Jack. He didn't offer a handshake. He gave a short, perfunctory nod. "We'll handle it from here, Correspondent. You and your men should get back to your unit." It was a dismissal. The incident was being absorbed, taken off his hands. There would be no citation, no commendation. Likely, there would be a confusing report buried in some headquarters file, a story too odd to be believed and thus largely ignored. Louis started the jeep's engine. The sound was familiar, yet alien. Jack slowly climbed into the passenger seat, his body feeling 100 years old. Leo slid into the back, next to the silent typewriter. They sat for a moment, the three of them, surrounded by the departing American troops, the last trucks carrying the prisoners rumbling away. Jack looked at the field. It was empty now, scarred by tire tracks and boot prints. The weapon pile was gone, hauled away. The only evidence was the trampled grass and a few discarded bits of ration tins glinting in the twilight. The willow trees swayed gently, as if nothing had happened. The bird from that morning did not sing. Louis put the jeep in gear and turned it around, pointing it back towards the road, towards the war, towards whatever lay ahead. They drove slowly past the last of the American guards, who paid them no mind. As they reached the edge of the valley and began the climb into the darkening woods, Jack did not look back. He stared straight ahead at the winding road, lit by their dim headlights. He had come to find a quiet story. He had instead lived through the loudest, most terrifying silence of his life. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never write a single word about it. The typewriter in the back remained strapped down, mute. The greatest story he would ever know was already receding behind him into the gathering German dusk, swallowed by the very silence from which it had been born.